Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started out at Procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today on the show, I'm delighted to welcome Melissa Drew, an associate partner at IBM. Melissa has 27 years of procurement and supply chain experience from both an industry and consulting perspective. She collaborates with organizations to reimagine what business and digital transformation should look like in order for companies to remain competitive. Melissa's also been a long-time supporter of Art of Procurement and was recently recognized internationally as a global leader in consulting in the Excellence in Influence category. Now, today's conversation with Melissa is all about cognitive technology and its application to procurement. There are few in procurement with as much experience as you're going to hear in the interview as Melissa does, and so I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Now, to kick things off, as always, I started by asking Melissa if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
I laugh because no one's ever asked me that question before.
Right.
I've been doing procurement technologies, procurement data since really early, 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was at Auburn University getting my degree in master's management information systems, and the professor said, "How many of you want to be a developer?" And everybody raised their hand except myself. I'm like, I don't want to be a developer. Two years later, I'm trying to put myself through the remainder of my school, and I'm out there building access databases and developing.
Right. You couldn't
And
escape it.
yeah, and the reason why that is important is, we have to remember that in the 1990s there was no automation.
Right.
Everything that we were doing was all human intervention, keyboards pounding, large sets of data. And what happened is I got a grant, through Auburn University with the intent of go talk to the Alabama apparel and textile company and see what you can do to help them.
Right.
Well, what they wanted is they wanted a way to capture supplier information, and they wanted a way to capture it and pull it into a central repository and then
Mm-hmm.
be able to analyze it, synthesize it, and then make decisions about their suppliers. So with the grant money, I used it to combine cold fusion, web development with a little Microsoft Access database, and I created the first publicly used automated RFX process.
Interesting.
Forms, on the website, collecting supplier information.
Yeah.
Pulled the data into this Access database, and then from there, I built the queries and the scripts to analyze the data and give them their decisions. And it was that component of that procurement piece that I was doing that really captured the attention of A.T. Kearney at the time, now
Mm-hmm.
known as Kearney. And from there, that is what catapulted me into procurement.
Very interesting. So very early, you were involved in procurement tech before there was procurement tech, for the most part.
Yeah, I think the timing, obviously my professor who was really good at getting grant money, it just all kind of came together.
Mm-hmm.
But I never thought of procurement as I'm going to go out and go to procurement.
Right. And those like mid-90s days at A.T. Kearney were pretty formative for the industry, weren't they? I mean, that was where they were really getting folks thinking about strategic sourcing and the 7-step process. And, I was in automotive at the time. I started in 2000, and that was, just starting to build category management out around some of those ATK frameworks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at the time I joined Kearney, they had an entire group called DMG, or Data Management Group.
Right.
And the DMG group is what sat between your procurement professionals and the decision makers in procurement. So we were the ones that was really the first tier of true data management, pulling all that data together. Again, this is all manual. I remember having a team that would go out to a client site, pull in really 5-6 data sets, and it would take them 9 weeks, working 70 hours a week to
Right.
manually harmonize, pull the data together, make it structured, synthesize it, classify it, and then be able to come back and say, here's where we think your opportunities lie. And here's where your first wave categories are. Here's where your second
Hmm.
wave categories are. And then we pass that over to the category managers, such as yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very early wave planning, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
When you look at everyone who was involved at AT Kearney at that time, and
Mhm.
how that team has dispersed across the industry and really become leaders across a variety of different segments of the industry over the last 20 years.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, they are. They are still very well known globally as the strategy,
Yeah.
not just procurement, but very strategic, very forward thinking and innovative thinkers. Yes.
So what I want to do today is actually have the opportunity to talk to you around cognitive technologies and the intersection of AI and cognitive technologies with procurement.
Hmm.
Um, Before I start, when I have discussions like this, I always like to um, set the context, or make sure that we're all kind of working from the same terminology, because cognitive is thrown around a lot, and a lot of times it's thrown around from a marketing perspective. Other times it's from a product perspective, and it means a lot of things, a lot of different things to different people.
Hmm.
So I just wonder if you could share a little bit about how we should be thinking about the definition of cognitive technologies when it comes to procurement.
Yeah, I've over time I've created my own perspective to try to simplify that because
Hmm.
I get the same question. When everyone talks about AI, it is a very huge umbrella. Like AI is this big umbrella, and there's just so many components underneath it. Now, if you think about it, you can think of AI in two separate groups. There's true AI, artificial intelligence, where an individual may, program the initial concept, but the system or the artificial intelligence is learning on its own after that. There's no
Hmm.
more human intervention. It's constantly learning on its own as new data comes in. Then there's where I fit in, or I'm more of a have expertise in, which is the cognitive technologies. And the cognitive technologies are we do have to have the human intervention to write the initial models or the algorithms. And then we also need to have the human intervention to come in and tweak them as new data comes in or as new assumptions are made.
Yeah.
So, for example, you hear, sentiment analysis, which you mentioned marketing.
Yeah.
Sentiment analysis is going out and looking at data and determining if people feel good about something or feel negative about something.
Hmm.
We've got the RPA, the robotics, which is basically taking a very tactical task that can be repeated. And instead of having a human intervention and pushing a button, every single day, taking that repeatable task and automating it.
Right.
And then the other piece to this is the natural machine learning, which we see a lot of in spend analytics or data analytics. So that's where I sit on the cognitive technologies,
Hmm.
not on the, let's go do the driverless automobiles.
Right.
That's way far on the other side.
Yeah, probably something we still need to keep our eye on, but maybe not for a few years yet.
Yeah.
Um, I want to talk a little bit about progression and what you're seeing in terms of use cases and all that, so that again it helps kind of visualize the usage of
Hmm.
cognitive technologies in procurement. Before I do, you actually wrote an article, or were quoted in an article in the AI Time Journal about looking back the last 5 or 6 years as being procurement's agile phase. I wonder kind of what kind of digital progress have you seen with that in mind that procurement has made over the last 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, I've read an article back in 2015 from Arden Partners,
Hmm.
and it was their standard annual CPO rising. And what was very unique about this particular year is that Arden Partners came out and said, we've been in this strategic phase of the procurement organization from the 1990s, which you and I just talked about, all the way to about 2014, 2015.
Hmm.
And Arden Partners said, going forward with the changing and the consumer demands, the procurement department is moving into a new phase of evolution, and it's called the Agile procurement organization.
Yeah.
And that the focus, the whole intent was to define the organization ability to quickly adjust to the changing needs of the consumer. And through that, a huge launch of business and digital transformations were just rapidly coming out in 2015 to about 2019, right before COVID hit.
Yeah.
But the challenge is, I mean, if you look back at the top three priorities of a chief procurement officer in that article, improve collaboration with lines of business,
Hmm.
implement stronger policies and processes, and number three was improve the use of technology.
Right.
I know 5 procurement officers right now who would give me the same
Yes.
3 goals
Yep.
in 2021.
Yep.
So whatever we were trying to do in these last 6 years, it wasn't working, and we still have a huge set of gaps that still haven't been resolved. And the theory in the market is now that we're shifting into, and I think that, what I've heard most is this intelligent automation or this intelligent procurement organization. It's supplementing these cognitive technologies to really plug those gaps that we got from not being able to do everything we were supposed to do when we were an agile organization.
Hmm. No, it's interesting. Like I started the podcast in 2015, and I feel like sometimes we're talking about exactly the same things, or
Hmm.
oftentimes exactly the same things now as we are in 2015. And honestly, that's sometimes frustrates me. But then I reflect again and think that progress has been slow. What's really exciting to me is I've seen such a change over the last 12 months, where it seems like things truly are happening.
Hmm.
Um, and it's almost, I was speaking as we're recording this in the middle of October. I was actually speaking to somebody today who suggested, and that this is somebody on the provider side who is working on a really interesting technology, that it's almost like we've skipped a generation of technology. Perhaps in that 5 years where we still looked at perhaps old school or more old school digitizing processes rather than what can cognitive do for us, what can AI do for us. And now
Hmm.
there's more solutions that are coming up that are actually taking advantage of this technology that's been around but never really been used from a procurement use case perspective.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I was using cognitive technologies in 2003, 2004, specifically with a patented grammar-based spend analytics tool.
Hmm.
I was writing models, I was pulling in data sets, I was doing some of the things that we're doing today. It wasn't called data science back then. It wasn't called AI. It wasn't even called cognitive technologies. It was just how can we do this quicker, more efficient, and automate it so that folks like Melissa sitting at Carney don't have to spend 12 weeks just to understand what their spend looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't need to send it, and as I'm sure that many listeners have done the same, sending it to a BPO or something like that for folks to do line level. And I've done many of those pivot tables myself in the past,
Hmm.
line level analysis of huge files to come up with something that, is kind of better than I knew before, but is not necessarily, it's directionally accurate rather than anything that is particularly, you would stand behind.
And now it's just grown so much. You mentioned this huge leap in the last 12 months. We've gone from, hey, this is a really great idea, to, wow, if we're not doing this, we're not going to be, we're not going to remain competitive within our industry.
Right.
It went from 12 months ago, it's nice to have, to now all of the major voices are, it's no longer a nice to have. It's
Mhm.
you need this if you need to, if you want to do anything.
Yeah, it's funny. Over the last few years, we keep talking about, we know this is going to happen, but we don't know when. That's kind of the crystal ball moment, is when's it going to happen, and I see it now happening. There's
Hmm.
so much investment that's coming into the procurement space around these technologies as well right now, more than ever before, and it's being adopted. I'm hearing of rocket ship companies just over the last 12 months, who are, once they have the use case, they're doing a really good job of being able to implement into procurement teams, and procurement teams therefore taking advantage of this tech.
Hmm.
When you look at, where we are right now, I mean, where do you see the biggest opportunities for procurement to leverage, cognitive technologies? I know we talked a little bit about spend analytics, but where should somebody be looking at their tech roadmap and thinking, I need to be leveraging cognitive tech in this part of my procurement process?
So spend analytics, we'll just say that's a given and set that one aside.
Yeah.
Um, some of the folks are using some of these large, procurement companies. They have what we would list as cognitive technologies.
Hmm.
I know because I've gotten certified in Jagger that
Yeah.
I know that they're using a type of neural network in their predictive analytics in their supply chain module. Um, I'm familiar again because I tried to spend as much time learning about all of these applications as I could. Seal software, a long time ago, they developed this conduit that allowed them, at the time it was very innovative, but I think we're seeing, it a lot more. But Seal software was going out there and let me send some automated kind of tech that goes through all of your servers, finds everything that could be potentially listed as a contract,
Hmm.
then let me read through it very quickly and then pull the data out of it and then put the data into a centralized database so that,
Interesting.
again, the whole point is to make a better informed decision.
Yeah.
So there's a Seal software. And then, when you're in procurement, you're not just looking at indirect and direct, but you're looking at logistics and you're
Hmm.
looking at transportation. And now we've got these infused technologies within our logistics companies that you may not realize that you just hired a 3PL or a 4PL, and they're using AI to really understand what's the most efficient delivery routes so that not only they can reduce their vehicle use, but ultimately, pass that savings on to the procurement team.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's an endless use cases now.
What do you think of? So I'm starting to see use cases emerging, for example, around automating negotiations. Automating the entire end-to-end sourcing process. Um, you know, is that where this is heading? And I say that not to say, oh, to make people panic. Oh, my job's going away. You can use these to to refocus what it is that you're doing on the things that are more strategic. I see this as a benefit, but are you seeing more and more use cases emerging and actually folks actually using the technology to start automating a lot of what we may have said 10 years ago? Hey, that's strategic. No, nothing's ever going to take away that part of my job.
I don't see a lot of that yet being used in procurement.
Okay.
I I hear about it. I'm interested in it. I think it's going to be more frequent,
Hmm.
but I don't think that the procurement organization in particular is fully ready to adopt it. And
Right.
and there are a lot of hindrances. There's the data culture. There's the mindset. Just adapting some of these technologies. Obviously, the one you mentioned is my job going to go away?
Right.
I am a huge advocate and supporter that just because you've adopted or you're using cognitive technologies are solely designed to augment the human intervention.
Hmm.
Because again, going back to that scenario, as an individual, it would take me weeks to go through just 4 data sets.
Yeah.
I've been talking to companies who said, "Oh my gosh, Melissa, we're now at 150 data sets." There's no way that even a huge, large team of people can synthesize that
Hmm.
much data and then be able to understand the context of it and then be able to come up with something that's going to be meaningful in an actionable time frame that makes the most impact for your procurement
Right.
organization.
Yeah. So you're able to actually gather insights that were uh, just you couldn't access them before. They were unavailable
Yeah.
to you before because we couldn't process that in that amount of data to be able to come up with those insights.
The initial purpose and where I still believe the purpose of that is these technologies are there to augment those tactical activities
Hmm.
so that the procurement individuals can truly now shift to a more value added job.
So I want to talk a little bit about kind of implementation, and I'll start with talent because you just talked about it there. Um, what do procurement professionals and leaders need to be thinking about when it comes to digital literacy? How can they better inform themselves on these technologies and what these technologies can do, so that they can take advantage of it rather than be impacted negatively by it?
I've I've been asking that similar question.
Hmm.
At the end of my article, one of the things I asked is, what is the role of the company to educate these team members?
Yeah.
Whose responsibility is it? And the more I've asked that in the procurement organizations, I'm getting this consensus that yes, leadership needs to know what it is and what they're doing and be able to communicate it, but ultimately it is the individual's responsibility to go out and understand it and learn it.
Hmm.
Which means that for the first time, and as long as I can remember, the procurement organization has to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's not a mindset that we're used to in procurement.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned it before. We've got, depending on who you go to, you've got a 5-step sourcing process, a 6-step sourcing process, a 7-step sourcing process. Ultimately, the framework has always been very similar. It's just, spinning the wheel here and there to make it fit what you need within your company. But now that you've mentioned just this huge, jump within the last 12 months, our procurement organization needs to start asking questions. And if they're not asking questions, then they're not going to be able to grow and evolve where the procurement organization needs to go.
Yeah, and from what I'm hearing, from CPOs and CPOs
Mhm.
that have invested in technology, and some of this really forward-thinking technology, is that the limitation on the roadblock that they now have is not the technology; it's their team's
Mhm.
ability to use the technology,
Yes.
and that digital literacy therefore becomes a roadblock for their transformation. Um, that to me one says that from an organizational perspective, if you want your change, if you want digital transformation to work and to stick, then there has to be a big element of investing in the training side and the education and all those things. But the reality is that if as an individual you don't necessarily get that, or you haven't invested yourself, then
Mhm.
the organization will find people who are digitally literate, and that may not be tomorrow, but when you look 3, 4, 5 years out.
You mentioned something just a minute ago that made me smile. You mentioned that the critical elements are culture
Hmm.
and change management.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm such a strong believer in both of those.
Yeah. Which
Technology
has
can only
been
take you
which has
so
been
far.
always which has always been a huge advocacy, I think, of everyone. If you
Yeah.
wanna have a true business transformation, we always looked at change management and culture as a part of just adopting the the return on investment of whatever it is you're looking to transform. But now that's even become more critical because it's not just about the ability to transform from point A to point B. It's also the ability to make sure that the people that you're trying to influence in that change understand the change,
Hmm.
understand why you're changing, but more importantly, understand how to use the new digital technologies that you need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I really believe that ultimately that's going to drive adoption. And I think one of the challenges we've had, maybe for the when we look over that last 5 or 6 years, is adoption of technology.
Mhm.
Maybe the technology wasn't that easy to use, or maybe when we didn't invest the time in helping folks, we just kind of built the technology, put it in, and said, "There you go, you're on your own." But that adoption is going to be critical, obviously, to the impact of any of this technology going forward.
There's one more, I think, critical component, and it's data literacy.
Hmm.
So even though we've got these really cool technologies, all of these technologies are dependent on the underlying data structure.
Yeah.
So now we're back to where we were, a long time ago, is focusing on the data. Everybody in the company needs to have this data literacy mindset. And now we've got huge explosions of new roles, chief data officer, chief analytics officer, that are developing, these larger data components, because it doesn't matter how many AI technologies you have or cognitive technologies. If you don't have the data in the right structure and the right format and all of the components, then your models are just going to be as good or as bad as the data.
Hmm. So does that mean, from a procurement leadership perspective, we need to be having our own data strategy. That not that's in a silo, but
Mhm.
taking accountability to ensure that we have a strategy to get clean data or to change the way that we generate data, as opposed to perhaps blaming it on somebody else, or looking at other parts of the organization, like a chief data officer, and thinking, well, that's kind of their job.
Mhm. 3 years ago, I walked into a very large company, and they were developing a very large data lake.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was working with them to understand where the data was coming from and how they're building this centralized corporate data lake, one of the things that I noticed is procurement wasn't involved. In fact, procurement wasn't even a stakeholder.
Mm-hmm.
But procurement should be, and it should be one of the leading stakeholders in these company-wide data transformations, because I mean, I'm a huge advocate. Procurement, data is the heart of the organization, but procurement's the backbone.
Yeah.
You know, but the procurement is involved because of the nuances with suppliers and procurement and strategies. Procurement, their tentacles go everywhere in the organization. So if anything, I always think that if you're going to build this huge data organization and you don't have procurement involved, then you're kind of missing the whole point of what you're trying to achieve. And then on the other hand, what I'm finding is, this goes back to what I said before, procurement needs to start asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular organization, procurement, I'm sure, was aware of what was going on because it was in every, conversation, but procurement didn't raise their hand and said, "Hey, we need to be a part of this. This is just as important to us as it is to everybody else in the organization."
Right.
So it goes both ways.
Yeah, we can definitely make more of a noise,
Hmm.
if we're not involved. And chances are, I imagine pretty much every organization right now is having these discussions about data, because, it's an enterprise wide challenge. And so if you're not involved in that as a procurement professional, procurement leader, if your team isn't involved in that, then it's happening somewhere. So you kind of need to find out where the conversation's at.
So I'm on LinkedIn, and I've been watching the job roles for chief data officer and
Mm-hmm.
chief analytics officer, or sometimes the combination. And just within the last 9 days, there have been 44 new job descriptions posted on LinkedIn with the role of chief data officer.
Right. So it's a growing.
Yes.
Organizations are placing more importance on the need to look at this holistically.
Yes.
Now, I got a couple of last questions. I want to ask you. We've talked a lot about um, the growth, emergence, usage of cognitive technologies. As a procurement organization is thinking about new technology, new cognitive technology, what are some of the questions they should be asking? Like, how do they go about their evaluation if they're in front of a particular provider or a set of providers, and they're trying to decide, separate the marketing from the reality?
Hmm. No, I think that's the big question of the day. When and I've been on the procurement side. I've been on
Right.
the consulting side, so I like being able to have looking at it from multiple views. When someone comes into procurement and says, "I've got this technology that can do X, Y, and Z, that can automate it," I think as a procurement professional, I would want to step back and rethink my questions. So gone is the day of 200 plus RFP questions,
Mm-hmm.
because those questions that we've been using for the last 10 years, none of those questions are going to be answered with the new technology that's out there. So we have to kind of throw out the whole playbook when it comes to what questions we're asking, and rethink looking at it from an outcome perspective.
Right.
Outcome based perspective. What is it that you need? I mean, you're obviously looking at these technologies or looking at this group of technologies for something. What is it you need to do? So start there, but then more importantly, as you dig deeper, really dive into what it is that the technology is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask questions such as, right, so what you're telling me is that the technology is going to automate my spend data, and then you're telling me that I have to go spend 2 weeks to go look at that data and touch it and then modify it and
Mm-hmm.
then make it better. Well, that's not the true definition of what an cognitive technology is supposed to do. I mean, yes, there's going to be a little bit of a learning, but if the system is out there doing X, and then you're hearing that internally they've got a group of people that are massaging the data, and then now they want you and your team to spend another 2 weeks massaging the data, maybe that's not quite going to be the right application for
Yeah.
you to invest in.
Yeah. Or you need to be aware of that for the business case.
Yeah, and it goes back to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this also, emphasizes the ask questions. My number one, the one thing that I could probably just convey to everybody is repeat what you think you heard from them,
Right.
especially with the cognitive technologies, because they're going to, it goes back to what you said this earlier. There's so much terminology out there, sentiment analysis and deep learning and machine learning. And you're going to hear all of this from these guys because it's all in their head. This is how they built it. It's okay to keep asking the questions until you can get them to explain it in a way that you understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And only then can you really then evaluate how is this competitor against the other competitor, and which one is really going to help me get the outcome that I need with as minimal touch points as possible, but increasing the accuracy of the data, increasing the confidence of my data. Because that's the other thing too, is you'll have companies out there that pretty much can do everything, but if you don't feel comfortable that the accuracy and the confidence of the data is there, then you're not going to be able to get the rest of your
Right.
organization to use it.
How do you determine that? How do you determine if your data is, let's say, good enough versus it's just going to be garbage in, garbage out, whatever tool you use? And perhaps there's somebody who's selling a software that's claiming that we're going to take care of that for you because we're going to cleanse it. We're going to use all the data that we've got from our, that we've learned based on our other clients. How much can we rely on that?
The bar is set differently for different industries.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, and I'll give you the example for healthcare. Healthcare has a really high bar. The confidence in their data is now going to be regulated by the FDA.
Okay.
So the FDA has come back, and the study I did with the FDA is they've actually deployed healthcare products that have AI infused technologies in the software. And now that it's become much more prevalent, the FDA is revising their policies and
Mm-hmm.
regulations to the extent that not only are they going to do a deeper dive into the quality of data, where the data is coming from, do you have any assumptions in your data? Were there limiting factors in your data? For example, if you used 300 patients for this piece of software, is that enough to get the level of confidence that you need? Did you use data from just 2 hospitals, or did you
Mm-hmm.
go out and get it from 50 hospitals? When you pulled the data together, did you get it from data that was being used on patients that have already gotten the illness, or did you do a proactive study to ensure that your models are going to proactively identify and diagnose? Healthcare has such a much larger threshold that aspiring to something like that, maybe I don't need that as much when I look at indirect procurement, contingent labor. So
No.
it's going back to that category planning that you
Mm-hmm.
talked about, redefining what the confidence and what data, what's okay data for me in indirect procurement, contingent labor versus my logistics and transportation versus something that's going to now be regulated by, a regulatory agency.
And it sounds like understanding how the model is built is something that maybe you should, because you talked about outcomes, and I completely
Mhm.
agree. Like, we want to focus on outcomes versus apples to apples, and I would imagine it's harder to compare apples to apples because different providers will have different methods and
Mhm.
different approaches to ultimately try and drive the similar outcomes. But how much should we be digging into the how behind how they build the models, and how do we even have the capability within procurement to understand the answer that we get? Maybe that's another question, but should we be curious about how the models actually work that are driving these cognitive technologies?
The models are only going to be work as good as the data.
Okay.
So for me, I focus more on the data coming in
Hmm.
and what kind of data is being used, reactive, proactive, all the limitations, the assumptions, because the model is just taking the data and churning it and synthesizing it and analyzing it. It's everything. It goes back to, I know that there's a lot of people out there remember the term dirty data in, dirty data out.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. The models are just there to augment what's already been collected. So for me, I look more at the data that was used in the model, not
Mhm.
necessarily the mathematical algorithm that was used to write it.
Okay. And my final question really is, as a procurement organization maybe thinking about using and leveraging cognitive technology, is it normal practice to look at doing a proof of concept or a pilot, looking at a certain data set and running some models based on that before you actually make um, a bigger decision? Like, are you seeing that in terms of how folks are engaging with these providers?
Absolutely. 100%. Absolutely.
So definitely include that in your in kind of the process rather than just going for one provider and kind of going all in.
Yes, it is right now the standard, I would say standard industry norm
Hmm.
that when you're working with a company, you do create a proof of concept, a pilot, whatever term is being used in your company, before you then scale it into production.
Yeah. Uh,
Because it's not just because it goes back. So you mentioned, what kind of investments do we need to take?
right.
I think the piece that a lot of folks are missing is, I'm really excited about the technology, and I'm going to use that technology, and I'm going to push my data into it. But we also have to make sure we've got the infrastructure in place, because once we scale it, we're not using that pilot data anymore.
Hmm.
Where's that data coming from? How frequently is the data being updated? Where's the data being stored? Did you have to do something to the data to transform it to become unstructured to structured? Then you've got the whole governance model around it. What's the quality of data? We talked about the limitations, the frequency, the data governance, so that once we've moved it into production and new data comes in, do we have the right program or the right governance in place to go and review those models? Because as we put more data in, that algorithm may slightly change how that data looks.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's the other piece, that we're really excited about the technologies. And if it's something like, and I'm going to use these procurement technologies, if it's something like that where they own the technology and they will own that governance.
Hmm.
But if you're buying a technology that you're going to use in-house, then we forget that there's this wraparound process that we need to make sure that we keep in mind before we scale it into production.
Well, Melissa, I know it's about time for us to wrap up. So, first of all, I want to thank you so much for your time and for your insights around cognitive technology. There's so much to kind of get a handle of, I
Mhm.
think, and honestly, what I'm seeing in the field right now is that there's kind of an increasing gap between those organizations really embracing it and those
Mhm.
organizations that aren't. And that gap, we need to make sure as a profession that gap doesn't get wider, because a lot of the future impact that we have at scale, I think, is dependent upon all procurement organizations embracing this technology rather than just a few of them. So the more that we can do to help folks along in their journeys and inspire to look at different ideas and technologies and not be afraid of it, I think is beneficial for all of us. So I truly appreciate the things that you've shared with our audience today. Um, the last question I always ask, you may have heard me ask it before, or that I always say it's an easy question. I'm sure based on today's conversation, there'll be folks who would really like to connect with you, learn a little bit more, perhaps find some of the things that you have written um, on cognitive technologies and procurement. Where would be the best place for them to find you?
Absolutely, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I have openly said that I will support and transfer knowledge to anybody openly and freely. And then I've also am associate editor for the AI Time Journal.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of content, podcasts, and written articles up there, deep diving, with interviews of some of these folks that we just mentioned, the chief data officer, the chief procurement officer, the chief analytics officer, and really wanting to know from their perspective what's critical.
All right, great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the show notes for today's episode, I'll put your LinkedIn profile, but I'll also put a link to the AI Time Journal so folks can directly go and find that. Those are all going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's where we have all of our podcasts, and you'll just be able to search for this interview with Melissa, and you'll find the show notes and those links. Melissa, one last time, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, this was awesome. We should do this in 6 months from now and revisit where we are in procurement.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.